Good evening, everyone. Hi, Andreas. Good to see you.
Hi, Raphael. Very nice to meet you.
How's it going?
It's all right. You?
Good. Excited. Excited about the next 90 minutes.
Yeah.
Having this conversation about you, which I think is one of the most crucial of our time, is how can we as civil society contribute to stopping the climate crisis? I will introduce myself real quick, and I think I always find it sort of weird when other people introduce their guests, so I hope it's okay if you introduce yourself. The climate crisis for the past couple of years. For most German media, like Der Spiegel, like Die Zeit, I'm writing a mix of reportages and essays. I've recently published this book together with a colleague where we visited frontline communities that are hit by climate change, by climate crisis already today, and saw and researched how they are facing the crisis and which answers they are finding. So much about me. I'm calling from Berlin. Andreas, you're calling from Malm, and you've been doing quite some different things in your life. Floor is yours. Who are you?
Yeah, thank you. I can just say I'm an associate professor of human ecology at Lund University. Lund is a town half an hour away from here. I've published a couple of books recently on climate politics. One together with the Zetkin collective called White Skin, Black Fuel on the Danger of Fossil Fascism. But I guess the one that's perhaps more relevant for the topic of today's conversation is called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, Learning to Fight in a World on Fire. I'm in case anyone wonders, I have some scratch marks here, and that's not because I've been engaged in some edgy climate activism recently. It's because I have a 3-year-old boy who likes to scratch me. He might make a cameo appearance in the back. He has a tendency to run into this room every now and then, but I hope he will contain himself.
Great, thank you. You've mentioned the book already, and I find it remarkable. The first time I heard about it was from a Fridays for Future activist who literally said, like, well, I mean, it looks like in 10 years, if nothing changes, we have to start to blow up pipelines. And it's not only being passed around in the climate movement, you're also getting quite some mainstream press attention. You just had an op-ed in The Guardian. I know Die Zeit from Germany, the weekly, had an interview with you. So this interesting mix of being seen on very different levels. You want to say a couple of words or a couple of more words about what's in this book? What's the idea you're presenting?
Yeah, let me just give a sort of comment on this press attention that you mentioned. The other day, the Financial Times listed this book as the first one in their list of the best books about climate change that came out this year, and it wasn't anything I expected. I also, and I can talk more about that later, but I was also approached by The Economist and asked to write an op-ed about these things, and that hasn't appeared yet. And it's a bit ironic for me because I've written a couple of books before, and no one has come anywhere close to advocating explicitly for militant activism in the way that this book has. But this is by far the book I've written that has had most mainstream attention. And I do not think that's because there's anything extraordinarily brilliant about the book as such. I think it's because we are in a historical moment where more and more people are beginning to think along these lines. And I should stress that my book is just one sign of this trend. There have been 2 important big novels published over the last year that have both featured property destruction, the destruction of fossil fuel property as major parts of their plots. One being How Beautiful We Were by Mbelo Mbue, where an African village in an unnamed country suffers extreme despoliation and pollution at the hands of an American oil company called Pexton. and the community rises up and starts to engage in quite militant forms of activism that includes systematic destruction of the property of this corporation. There's only a tiny little allusion to the climate crisis as such. It's more about the local pollution that affects the community directly. The other novel is, of course, The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, probably more famous than Mbu's book, that features this as a very central part of its plot. And there are way more people than I personally who are thinking along these lines. So I think that my book just happened to come at the right historical moment, where we've had, as we know, an unprecedented wave of climate activism in the global north that hit a peak just before the pandemic broke out, and then crashed completely. Some momentum is regained, but far from all of what was lost in 2019. But I think there is a general sense in the movement that we need to try to step up and escalate, and people are discussing what will this mean. And there is, you can sort of sense that there is a search for the appropriate path forward and the tactics that can be really disruptive. You see this with the hunger strikers in Berlin, or with the Insulate Britain in the UK and elsewhere. Yeah, so my book is just an argument that we need to escalate, and that the time has come to consider more militant forms of action against property, such as sabotage and property destruction. Not killing people by any means. Yeah, that's what I can say as an introduction.
I found, reading your book, I found the historical part really interesting, talking about the UK, talking about India, South Africa. You want to elaborate on that a bit before we go into a discussion?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, the book is very much an outcome of the conjuncture of 2019, and a product of that moment when, of course, we had a great deal of excitement about the mass scale of the movement that we had wished for for a very long time, those of us who have been around in the climate movement for some time. But also a bit of frustration with us doing, the same thing over and over again, it felt like. And this frustration, in my case, was also triggered by the positions taken by Extinction Rebellion in 2019, or the leadership of Extinction Rebellion, that when the movement was founded said that we're going to engage in absolutely peaceful civil disobedience, but we must never go beyond this kind of action. And this strategic pacifism, so the idea that as soon as you deviate from absolutely peaceful modes of action and go into anything that smacks of violence, any kind of more militant confrontation, you immediately lose popular support and alienate yourself and become a fringe phenomenon. This strategic pacifism was based on a particular reading of history, where Roger Hallam and other founders of XR claimed to have found more or less an absolute law saying that the only thing that works in history is absolutely peaceful civil disobedience or civil resistance. And some of the cases that they advanced for this position were the abolition of slavery, the suffragette struggle for the women's vote, the civil rights movement in the US, the various anti-colonial liberations, not the least what happened in India, led by Gandhi, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, the various toppling of dictatorships in Eastern Europe and during the Arab Spring in the Middle East. And then in the book that much of this is based on, Why Civil Resistance Works, by Chenoweth and Stevens, Maria Stevens and Erika Chenoweth. Then they also advance a lot of other cases, such as the Iranian Revolution and the Palestinian Intifada, the First Intifada, and things like that. And as a historian, this triggered me also because it's in such direct contradiction to very easily accessible evidence about what actually happened in those various episodes. And we don't need to go into the details, but I mean, just to start with the abolition of slavery, the idea that slavery was abolished by some kind of absolutely peaceful civil disobedience is almost ludicrous, because slavery was first abolished in Haiti through a popular revolution that was quite bloody. And its abolition in the US happened after a civil war that killed more people than have been killed in all the other conflicts that America has been involved in combined. That's obviously not to suggest that we need a civil war to solve the climate crisis. It's to suggest that their reading of history is extremely flawed. Yeah. So yeah, we can go into other perhaps more relevant cases, such as, for instance, the great uprising after the murder of George Floyd last year, where
if you would compare the struggle in the climate crisis, which historic case, where would you compare it to?
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned quite a wide range, but they have all very specific strategic setups. So where are we at with the struggle against the climate crisis, against the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah. I think it's very hard to say that we know of any perfect analog in history. There isn't really a precedent for what we're facing right now. There isn't any social movement or social struggle in history that we can pinpoint and say, this is the model for how we're going to win the climate battle, because there are so many different things about the problem of the climate crisis. And we are in a very, very particular historical moment where the working class and various revolutionary or subversive social movements in the global north are at their weakest point in history. And you can say much the same for quite significant parts of the global south as well. So I don't think that we have any blueprint, any model to go by, and I don't think that yeah. I think that what lessons we can draw from the past are more in a general nature. We can see that to overcome deeply entrenched interests and make serious advances in the struggle for justice, you have to mobilize a lot of force to defeat those interests. And that usually combines a plethora, a great variety of forms of action, ranging from very militant to normally a bulk of peaceful methods, or quite commonly at least. And if this is anything to go by, we're going to need the same in the climate movement.
So you would argue it needs a militant wing combined with a mass movement, and basically, yeah, what you said, a lot of different tactics and strategy.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know of any case in history actually where you've had only one tactic being deployed, right, or where you've had actually. I mean, in none of these cases that we just mentioned, listed quickly, in none of these cases has there been exclusively peaceful forms of protest.
Right.
So if the climate movement is engaging and advocating exclusively peaceful forms of protest, it needs to explain why our struggle would be different from all of these other struggles, in that it doesn't need anything more militant than that.
Right. Okay, before we go more into this, talking about whether we need a social change, right? We need to change our economic system, we need to change our societies. Do you have a theory of how that works? Do you deduct it from history? Like, how do you see this change happening?
Yeah, no, I don't have a transhistorical theory of social change. I mean, I think any idea of a strategic path forward has to be very concrete and has to be rooted in the particular circumstances of the time and space where you are living, and try to make a difference. I mean, I have a background in revolutionary Marxism, so of course I have some more general ideas about how society changes when it changes. But that's not so important here. What I think we can see quite clearly is that advanced capitalist states, so staying in the global north for the time being, but it goes for much of the south as well, are not going to phase out fossil fuels and abolish fossil capital of their own accord, of their own inner volition, by their own initiative, if it's ever going to happen, it's going to happen due to mass pressure from outside of the state apparatuses. And how that will play out is anybody's guess, because it's still a speculative scenario. We're quite far from that situation. But we've seen in recent years that the climate movement can amass quite significant force in terms of numbers of people on the streets and things like that, and make an impact on political agendas and election outcomes and certain policy decisions in the global north. Presumably, if we were to become stronger when the crisis deepens, as it will inevitably do, there would be potentially an opportunity for us to force state apparatuses to concede to certain key demands, and therefore potentially set in motion a process of dismantling the fossil fuel industry or fossil capital or whatever you want to call it.
Right. So the state is the significant actor in this whole system. You need the state to stop the climate crisis, right? That's what you're saying.
Yes.
And which role can violence, destruction of property play in convincing the state?
Yeah. So to not to sound entirely abstract here, I think if we look at what happened in the US last year, we get not a perfect template for what the climate movement is facing, but at least an idea of how social change can happen in our countries in our time. And the revolt after the murder of George Floyd was a mass revolt on a scale that the US hadn't seen before ever in its history, if you count by the number of people who were on the streets. But it was set off by a very radical form of property destruction, namely the burning down of the police station in the 3rd precinct, where Derek Chauvin and his colleagues had been based 3 days after the murder of George Floyd. And throughout the whole wave of turmoil on the streets that we saw in the US last year, there was an element of militant confrontation with property destruction on a quite significant scale in Minneapolis and many other places, and confrontation with the police order. This, unlike what strategic pacifism would predict, went hand in hand with a much broader mobilization of peaceful protest. There was, of course, tension, as there always is, between those who go for more radical tactics and the more peacefully inclined majority. But there was, I think, a productive dialectic between the two that contributed to the downfall of Donald Trump last year, and to some, although very limited, concessions from state apparatuses, including, various initiatives to defund the police, or at least reduce police budgets in the US, right, and perhaps even abolish it in Minneapolis. Now, what the climate movement needs is something similar, and it needs our equivalent to conquering police stations and destroying them.
So let's go back there. What do you think? What was the role of burning down that police station? Like, how did it contribute to the success of the success of BLM? Yeah.
Yeah. So, in my understanding, and I'm here partly drawing on Vicky Osterweil's writings about this in The Nation, the burning down of the police station signaled to people that the systematic violence of the police force against African Americans is not a natural condition. It's not something that we just have to resign ourselves to. As she argued, the burning down of the police station brought this problem and brought the police back into the realm of history. It showed people that this isn't a biological law. It's not our fate. It's something that we can go in and put a stop to very concretely by taking over the facilities, the installations where this violence emanates from, and put an end to those places. So that was a catalyst for the movement. And I think that the climate movement needs something similar. Here, I really need to stress that Ende Gelände has worked in precisely this way, and other movements of that kind in Europe, that, showing people that we can actually go into mines and shut them down, at least temporarily, has empowered a lot of people to struggle and to see that this burning of lignite mine isn't something that we just have to accede to. It's something that we can potentially put a stop to. It's just that I think we need more of this, and we need it on a bigger scale. And when the crisis deepens and the climate disasters become worse and more frequent, we also need to step up, not just perhaps take over a digger, but pull it apart, destroy it somehow.
Would you differentiate between something like Ende Gelände does, which is like putting your body on the line but being passive about it, and burning down a police station or taking apart a digger? Would you say there's a different quality to that kind of violence?
I mean, Ende Gelände, for a start, isn't engaged in property destruction, except for the what happened, for instance, this summer with the Fridays for Sabotage, who apparently this little group.
Well, there were. I mean, yes. Let's stick to the question. You think there's a in quality or in strategy a difference between like just putting your body somewhere to say stop, you can't go no further, or like walking into somebody's property and burning it down? You would say that.
Yeah, of course, there's a difference. Yeah, of course.
How so?
Of course, but we also should keep in mind that property destruction can take essentially two forms. It can be premeditated and deliberate, or it can develop in the heat of the moment. And if you look at the case again of the Floyd uprising, you saw both elements. So when the people took over the police station, that was after 3 days of rioting, of street combat with the police. So I don't think anyone had made up a plan, as you do for an election, they're actually going to go into this police station and burn it down. It developed spontaneously out of the confrontation of the streets. On the other hand, when people went up to the statues of Confederacy generals or slave traders in the US or in the UK and pulled those down, that was planned in advance. Yeah. And I think the climate movement so far has almost exclusively, virtually exclusively, operated on the basis of we're going to do this and that, and we're planning it in advance, and we're going to do it. And that's good. That's great. That's how Ende Gelände works and everything else. But I also think that to make a historical difference, at some point we need to have that more eruptive kind of takeover by a big crowd that is very enraged about what's happening, a takeover over some kind of a fossil fuel installation. And it speaks to the feebleness or the weakness of the climate struggle so far, that hasn't happened yet.
Then, I mean, one criticism that you often hear, and I talked to several researchers that said, like, basically violence is always the turf of the state. I mean, violence is what the state does with the police, with the military, and also it's easy for lobbies to spin. When there's violence, it's easy to say, like, oh, look at these radicals, they're destroying things, and this hurts the movement overall. How can you forego this? How can you?
No, you can't forego it, and you can't ignore it. Of course, there are risks of this kind. Now, the violence is the terrain of the state, but any kind of disruption is the terrain of the state. I mean, any kind of disobedience you engage in, any kind of law breaking you engage in, you expose yourselves to the powers of the state. Likewise, you expose yourselves to different kinds of demonization in the media and things like that. Just look at what's been going on with Insulate Britain in the UK over the past weeks. Yeah. So, if you are contemplating sabotage or property destruction or something like that, I would argue you need to be careful about your targets, and you need to make sure that what you're doing makes sense to people, and that it can be explained, and that it can gain mass support, and that you don't just alienate the audience you intend to speak to, but brings it into action, right?
How do you do that?
Yeah, how do you do that? Well, I'm not sure that I have a recipe, but I think to begin with, a couple of reflections. We in the climate movement need to learn to strike in the moment of heat. So when there is an actual climate disaster happening and people are most concerned and terrified and potentially angry, that's when you need to strike. To show people that unless we put a stop to fossil fuel production and combustion, this is just going to happen again and again and again and again and again. until we're done for. Take the case of Italy, a country that suffered tremendously this past summer from wildfires and extreme heat in the southern part of the peninsula and torrential rainfall in the northern part of the peninsula. Some places such as Sicily has suffered both within the course of just a few months. And polls indicate that concerns about the climate crisis are rife in the Italian population and climbing precipitously. Now, Italy has another company such as Total called Eni, which, according to the revelations made by the Glasgow Agreement people during the COP26, is the most aggressive company right now in the world when it comes to opening new oil and gas fields. So between now and the end of 2022, something like 800 new oil and gas fields will be open in the world, and about 40 of those will belong to Eni, and that's more than any other single company. Now, what you did not have in Italy this summer was how should I put this? A wave of action against Eni. But I do believe that next time Italy suffers this badly, and it's going to happen again, obviously, the climate movement should target Eni and make clear to people that this is the source of your misfortune and suffering. And unless we close it down, and we have a major climate criminal headquartered in our country, unless we close it down, we are doomed to have more and more and more of this. I think if that is done in a reasonably intelligent and communicative fashion, it stands a good chance to not alienate people, not paralyze them, but work in a way similar to the conquest of the police station in Minneapolis. And the point here also really should be to find ways of targeting corporations, targeting the capital that is being invested in fossil fuels. And if you want to go for the consumption sphere, target the luxury consumption of the rich. The surest way to piss off people is to randomly spoil people's days in the way that Insulate Britain has been doing in the UK over the past weeks. Now, we can discuss in details the pros and cons of their tactic, but you see a lot of popular outrage against what they're doing, and that's fundamentally because they are randomly targeting people who drive along highways and get responses from truck drivers such as, well, why are you targeting me? Am I stopping you from insulating Britain? Why are you not going after the millionaire oligarchs instead? Yeah. So any movement of this kind would need to have some basic class consciousness and target fossil capital as a process of accumulating capital through the production of fossil fuels. Again, here's where Ende Gelände has, to my mind, been so efficient or smart, because it has targeted the sites of production, while you have other branches of the climate movement that have been much vaguer, I think, in their targeting practices.
You mentioned anger, and I find that super interesting. Like when you look at any other or many other movements, social movements on the left and the right, there's often a display of anger. You mentioned BLM. I've seen loads of different movements in Germany on the left and right, in the Antifa, but also in the Pegida, and everywhere there's like people angry in the streets, and only the climate movement is usually like behaving very, I mean, polite, but also like ironically, and having little signs and like having their protests. Why is there such a, let's say, complex relation of the climate movement to anger? Why is there, it's almost like taboo. Why is that?
Very good question. And I really don't, I can't give a convincing explanation of it. You're absolutely right. And this is what the research on psychology and climate and social movements generally also suggests. You know, there have been these debates about whether the climate movement should frighten people or should give them hope. Should we scare people by telling them how bad things are and are likely to get, or should we give them, you know, the idea that we can head towards some much more hopeful and better world and things like that? And the answer is that what really tends to drive social mobilization and social movements on the street is fundamentally anger. So the climate movement needs to learn to articulate anger, and the fact that it hasn't done so successfully yet is again a sign of its shortcomings, because there is so much to be angry about. I mean, all of these reports coming out about how companies like Total and many others are continuing to expand fossil fuel infrastructure, or the fact that the richest 1% of humanity has emitted more than twice as much as the poorest half of humanity since the 1990s, if you count by consumption, and this share is growing. I mean, all of these things, or when rich people go into space, as they're not allowed to do, the ultra rich, they produce as much emissions in 10 minutes as an individual will do in an entire lifetime if that individual belongs to the poorest billion of people. Now, these might sound like abstract reports, but still they should give people reason for anger. And if you combine the frustration that people feel when climate disasters hit with the knowledge of what's going on, what these companies are doing, RWE destroying a village, or Total expanding in Eastern Africa or in the Arctic or in Iraq, then I think there is a reservoir of anger that we need to learn to let loose somehow on the streets.
There are people that say in your book you're doing a bit of cherry picking, and that movements in the past weren't successful because they were violent, but despite the violence on the fringes, that this violence on the fringes was usually more like a burden to the wider movement. What do you say about that?
Well, I'm perfectly aware. I think I indicated that in the book, that there are negative radical flank effects. So you have radical flanks that damage the wider cause of movements. That's not very hard to come by. But I doubt that in any of the cases that we have been talking about here, the ones that we mentioned briefly, that you can say that the confrontational tactics harmed the general progress of the movement. So I don't think, for instance, that the urban riots of the 1960s essentially harmed the cause of Black liberation. I don't think that the armed struggle of the ANC slowed down the abolition of apartheid. I don't think that various anti-colonial revolutions with armed wings would have happened faster without those armed wings, and so on and so forth. Of course, I could have written a book about all the situations where the reverse has applied. So, for instance, you could argue that in the anti-globalization movement that we had between 1999 and 2003 or something like that in the global north, there were a few instances where the Black Bloc or the radical flank actually damaged the movement overall. What happened in Gothenburg 20 years ago, some would argue, fits that model very well. But there's no reason for me to put out a book cautioning against militant activism as potentially dangerous when we don't have that in the climate movement. Mm-hmm. I mean, what we have in the climate movement, as you said, is overwhelmingly polite and gentle protest. And then perhaps the time is right to ponder, well, given these stakes and the magnitude of the crisis we're in, perhaps we need to look at those situations where we've had positive radical flank effects, where militant components have helped the struggle. Not to focus on the negative radical flank effects. But of course they've existed. And of course, and I think I try to hedge my argument all the time with, there are dangers, there are risks, there are hazards with going down this route that we need to be very careful, that we need to be very aware of. Yeah.
And these are only strategic risks, or you see the risk of a escalation of violence from property towards harming humans?
Yeah, of course. I can't say that risk doesn't exist, but I'm wary of the argument that you often hear that as soon as you overstep the boundary from absolutely peaceful civil disobedience, you inevitably let loose a spiral of violence that you can't control. I mean, yeah, I don't think there is any law to that, because I think there are a lot of cases in history where the level of violence that a movement uses is actually determined by the movement. I mean, the anti-fascist movement in Sweden, for instance, made a principled decision to never kill a Nazi. And it didn't matter that the Nazis killed something like 20 or 30 people in Sweden from the mid-1990s to a couple of years ago. And there were several situations where anti-fascist action contemplated retaliation. This principle was held on to. And that's not because the anti-fascist action is a pacifist organization, but it's because it made a decision about what kind of violence we're going to engage in and a calibration of that violence. And I think the same applied to the radical flanks of the BLM movement last year in the US. That, you know, it's not because there are no guns to get hold of in the US that no police bosses were assassinated or, you know, bombs thrown into police headquarters or something like that. It's because there was a collective realization in a very big movement that if we cross that step, then we're doing something that's extremely problematic morally, and that's also going to backfire tremendously against us. So I don't accept, of course, there are risks. There are risks with every kind of path that we're taking in this moment for the climate struggle. But I don't think that it's predetermined that once you diversify into more militant tactics, such as property destruction and perhaps the occasional confrontation with police, you will inevitably end up, I don't know, sending suicide bombers against your enemies or something like that. That's not how it works, I think.
Right. One thing I observed, and that's really like anecdotal evidence, but people that recommended me your book were mostly male. You think there's a gendered aspect to like men being more prone to like blowing up pipelines while women are like cooperation, bigger movements, compromise?
Well, I wouldn't reject that, but I would also know of quite a few feminists who would say that that conforms to a very stereotypical image of women. And, you know, in quite a few cases that we've talked about, women have been at the forefront of very militant activism. I mean, the suffragette movement, as we mentioned, there was a feminist movement. The struggle against slavery is filled with women leading fairly violent slave rebellions. I mean, you in Germany, you have your own history with a violent left, largely led by female activists. So it's not like you cannot have, I mean, that, you know, women are always soft and men are the ones that want to do.
Well, I'm not implying that, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I understand. I do understand that you didn't mean it that way. Yeah, but yeah, on the other hand, yes, there is perhaps a kind of masculine culture of being more aggressive, but the forms of property destruction that I sort of describe in the book are not necessarily testosterone-filled forms of aggression. A case that I write quite extensively about is that of Jessica Resnicek and Ruby Montoya, who have been in the news again recently, largely because of the prison term that Resnicek is facing now, 4 years, I think it is. These were female Catholic workers who destroyed again and again construction equipment and parts of the Dakota XL pipeline. After the peaceful struggle had been lost, and for half a year they went up and down the route of the pipeline and put it on fire, put the construction equipment on fire, and blew things up with Molotov cocktails and whatever sort of different methods they used. For them, because they come from a particular Catholic tradition, radical Catholic tradition, this doesn't count as violence. It's a form, for them, it's a kind of non-violence because they're only exclusively destroying property. And I'm fine with that definition. I don't have a quarrel with it. But this is clearly, evidently, it's something that women can do just as well as men.
Right. Let me just address the audience in about 15 minutes. If anybody has a question, please send it into the chat and we'll open the discussion in about 15 to 20 minutes. As we're already at it, Andreas, forms of violent protests, forms of more radical, more militant civil disobedience that work. What are examples you found? What would you recommend as techniques that work?
Oh, I mean, let's look at the specific case of Total. since we have this wonderful campaign going on now, Collapse Total. I mean, Total is one of the major climate criminals in the world today. Its perhaps most insane project is the East Africa crude oil pipeline, the ECOP, which will be the world's longest heated pipeline. And the construction is going to start this year. And I actually made a calculation based on a paper that came out in Nature Communications this summer, where a researcher from Columbia University came up with a specific number of how many people will die because of 1 million metric ton of CO2 emitted in 2020. And he only counted the deaths from exposure to heat. Yeah. And his number was 226. And if you take this number and you multiply it with the emissions that will come from the 216,000 barrels of oil that the ECOP pipeline will convey to the world market every day, the number you get is 7,600 people killed every year by the ECOP pipeline. And this is exclusively the excess heat. So it doesn't take into account the hurricanes, the storm surges, the droughts, the food supply shocks, the wildfires, and everything else that comes from global warming. Only exposure to excess heat. So that's a low estimate. But what this means is that the ECOP pipeline will be a source of mass death. And we have then also the recent signing of a deal between Total and Iraq for mass new oil and gas installations in the southern part of that country. We have Total planning to go into the Arctic to drill for more fossil gas and so on and so forth. In a situation such as this, to me, it makes perfect sense to target the property of this company, because obviously the relevant state institutions are just encouraging Total to go on. So Emmanuel Macron, for instance, the French president, is super enthusiastic about the ECOP because he sees it as an amazing opportunity to increase French economic presence in East Africa. And in that situation, just imagine that people in Uganda and Tanzania would start destroying construction equipment on a massive scale, like Resnicek and Montoya did in the US, but on a much more massive scale, carry away the pipeline segments, destroying construction equipment or whatever. And the project has to be canceled. Or imagine that a climate movement in Europe targets Total properties to the point where the company has to cancel this project. And imagine again, if we just, for the sake of argument, that no one is killed in these protests. It's just property that gets destroyed. I mean, this isn't unthinkable. What you would have is a situation, if that were to happen, a speculative scenario, but if that were to happen, you would have prevention of mass death. Because all of these 10,000s of people who would be killed every year by the oil taken through the ECOP would potentially then be saved. And I think the moral case for doing this is overwhelmingly strong. Obviously, the question is, do we have the capacity to pull something like this off? Or what would it take to establish the capacity to do something like this? To begin with, some people will have to start doing some things. And I think the Collapse Total campaign is an eminent beginning. It's clearly not going to reach that mass scale of property destruction within the next couple of weeks. But who knows, in a year or 2 or 3, when the crisis intensifies and more people get their lives destroyed by the climate crisis, what are people going to do in the end?
You mentioned Insulate Britain as a campaign earlier, and you said that was super successful, in some parts really difficult. Why do you think it's good to target companies, or why are companies a good target versus other potential targets?
Well, the climate crisis is fundamentally driven by investment in fossil fuels. I mean, there are other drivers as well. There are other greenhouse gases, there is deforestation, and so on. But the core of the problem clearly is continuous expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. And the responsibility for this process is not evenly shared within society. You and I don't have any control over what energy Total banks on, for instance. It's up to the shareholders, to the investors, to the owners, to the CEOs of these companies to make these decisions. And the fact is that a company like Total, this goes for BP and Shell and the others as well, of course, investment in fossil fuels is still way more profitable than investment in renewable energy projects. So there is a brilliant article that came out recently that demonstrated this in detail, that the internal rate of return, so the measure of profit that these companies use, is about 5% for renewable energy projects, but it's about 15 to 20% for fossil fuel projects. So no matter the greenwashing that these companies engage in, and as you might have seen, Total has this advertisement campaign that energy is changing, so we're changing name to Total Energy. That's a trend in the sector right now, that all these companies are changing their names, or some of them at least. But still, if you look at their actual, you open their books, what they're doing is they're continuing to pour their money into more and more oil and gas, because that's where the profits are. And this just cannot continue if we're going to, in any way, contain global heating. The International Energy Agency said about a half year ago that we shouldn't have any new installations in oil and gas and coal if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees of global warming. That's a super reasonable minimum demand, but it comes off as fantastically revolutionary because it goes right against business as usual and what's going on the ground. So it makes much more sense to strike at the source of this problem than to target commuters, for instance, who might have no real choice in their lives but to take their car to their workplaces, perhaps because there is public transportation and they live far away from where their workplace is. Right. These people are caught in the system and shouldn't be burdened with the responsibility for it. That's my view.
But do you really believe a climate movement can produce so many costs to companies that it becomes less and less interesting to invest in fossil fuels? I mean, that's a lot of money that they spend, and there's a lot of money they earn, and there's a lot of infrastructure you would have to damage. I mean, you mentioned these two Catholic workers activists who spent half a year damaging the pipeline, and you really think it made a difference?
No, but they were only two individuals. I mean, imagine they had been 20. Imagine there'd be 200. Imagine they'd been 2,000 doing that.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, this isn't something, as I said, that we have an evident capacity to pull off in the present moment.
Right.
But things are going to get worse, and we have to bank at least on a minimum of rationality in the human species, meaning that more people should become concerned about the climate crisis in the next few years and decade. And more people should be ready to take risks because the dangers will become more and more obvious. Obviously, this doesn't apply to all of humanity. I'm not suggesting that we're going to win everyone over. There will be a very sizable chunk of humanity that's never going to even recognize the existence of a crisis. But our numbers should grow, and that should also mean that our capacity to engage in more actions of this kind should grow if we open up for doing it. If we continue to say we are absolutely forbidden from ever going beyond absolutely peaceful civil disobedience. And of course, this is not going to happen. But if the movement starts to discuss this, and if we have more branches, more currents within the movement, and some are developing other forms of tactics, then who knows how these things can develop.
Right. Jumping back to the beginning of the conversation where you said the state is actually the crucial actor in shutting down fossil infrastructure, in stopping the climate crisis. Isn't it a detour to go through the companies? Wouldn't it be possible to pressure democratic systems into making the necessary steps directly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess this is the XR strategy, or at least the initial strategy of XR in the UK, that we are going to shut down central London and put pressure on the government to do things.
Right.
And I'm not saying that is wrong, but I think when you target companies, you are, how shall I put it? You are exercising a kind of pressure on them that is also a pressure on the state to act. So if we look at, for instance, the struggle around coal in Germany, I mean, lignite coal in Germany was not, as far as I can tell, a contested phenomenon before Ende Gelände started its campaigns.
Right.
And Ende Gelände, the Ende Gelände campaign did not target state apparatuses. I mean, they didn't occupy ministries or anything, something like that. They occupied lignite mines under the demand that there has to be an immediate phase out of those mines. And that demand is, of course, made in relation to the state. It's a demand that we ask the state to fulfill. And because of Ende Gelände, we had the coal phase-out commission in Germany, which obviously came up with a completely unacceptable date, 2038. That commission wouldn't have happened without Ende Gelände, but it happened. The result was completely unsatisfactory. That's because the balance of forces wasn't advantageous enough for Ende Gelände, for the climate movement. That's because of the force that the AfD, some of the trade unions, the Social Democrats, and of course the companies themselves amassed against us. But I think you can imagine that further down the road, if Ende Gelände and other kinds of climate movements in Germany were to become stronger, that this balance of forces could potentially shift. And that I don't think, well, perhaps that would work better if state institutions were also targeted, but I don't think that it's necessarily a detour to go for the companies where production, the companies that are to take the actual production. I think, because rather I think you then hit the source of the problem and you sort of demonstrate to the state that this is the source that you need to shut down.
Right. We've been talking about like which emotional conditions it needs for a movement, and you said it's anger. And I almost feel that there's a fear in the movement that anger is something like almost a civilizational regression. Like fear is something for people that can't control themselves. Is that maybe one of the problems, that fear is, yeah, it's a taboo, it's something, it's almost like a civilizational no-go.
That fear is taboo, or anger?
Oh, anger, sorry.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe. I haven't thought about it this way, but you might be right. I mean, there is a strand of environmentalism in the global north that is, I would say, quite inclined to virtue and cleanliness, and afraid of soiling itself or spoiling itself with dirt, including forms of destruction or something like that. So there is, because we're combating pollution, we have the idea that we have to be clean and pure, and more so perhaps than other movements. And this, I think, also stems from a particular demographic basis that as one kind of environmentalist has in the global north, which is fairly highly educated, fairly privileged white middle class. So the BLM movement, for instance, or the Gilets jaunes, two other very important social movements in the global north, have had very different demographic bases in racialized communities, in the working class, in the US and France respectively, and have had different relations to the question of tactics and the police and violence and things like that. Obviously, this is just one strand of environmentalism, because there are other kinds of environmental struggles, not the least in North America, with all the indigenous resistance happening there, that has different features than this kind of environmentalism. But we need to learn to articulate the social anger that people have, and not create a contradiction between anger against the rich and anger against the destruction of the climate, because these two angers really should be one and the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's major what you're touching there. There's certain moral superiority often in the climate movement towards the working class. Nobody would ever articulate this, but I feel like it's sort of in the DNA. But before we go there, and let's see There's a question from our audience. It sounds very much like it's someone from the Collapse Total movement. He asks, how can we make the climate movement move against an oil company? How can you motivate them?
Well, I mean, to begin with, I have to say that when it comes to Total, the responsibility here falls heavily on France, because Total is headquartered in France. It's the single largest private company in France. And I was very pleased to hear a report just before this conversation started that things are finally kicking off in France with occupations of fuel stations belonging to Total and things like that in France. I mean, to me, over the past decade or whatever it is, it's been very paradoxical to follow the developments in France and Germany, because France has by far more vibrant tradition of social struggle than Germany has. It has regular eruptions of social struggles, such as the Gilets jaunes, the Nuit debout, the struggles against police brutality, strikes on a mass scale that very often, if not always, include militant confrontation with property and police. Germany has nothing comparable, but Germany has a climate movement that has been far, far more advanced than what we've had in France, as far as I can tell. And that's largely thanks to Ende Gelände. But if you look at Fridays for Future, it's virtually a German movement in Europe these days. I mean, there's nothing comparable in France, and I really can't get my hands around why this is the case. I mean, there are some explanations that you can have, but really, the French comrades need to step up the struggle against Total and learn to direct some of their capacity for militant action against that company. That shouldn't be impossible. I think, I mean, part of it is just to learn from the Germans how to wage effective mass struggle against fossil fuel companies. Part of it is to apply the very venerable French traditions to this front. Yeah, it strikes me as paradoxical that it hasn't happened yet, but I hope that this campaign will change things. I think that next summer, if there is another mass heat wave in France or a very significant climate disaster in France, it's probably going to happen very soon because it's happening all over Europe, all over the world, obviously. Then that's the moment to go harder and further and tell people that we have a responsibility to shut this company down. It has no reason to exist. It should be taken over and turned into a completely different kind of entity for something else than just pumping more CO2 into the atmosphere. This shouldn't happen in all countries. I mean, we have an oil company in Sweden that should be treated the same way. Very disgusting oil company. Yeah.
And this is maybe where we can loop back to our last topic. How can you connect these two issues of like the climate movement and making clear that it's a very small class profiting off fossil fuels? How can you link these two also to bridge the gap between a climate movement that's often, as you say, very white middle class and a more working class?
Well, yeah, to begin with, these corporations have shareholder meetings, they have headquarters, they have investors in banks. It's not like it's impossible to find where the capitalists are active. It's just that that's a level of struggle that we haven't been engaged with in Europe for a long time, or at least not in some respects. Again, I have to stress that I'm not suggesting that we should target anyone individually. I think it would be absolutely disastrous if anyone went up and, I don't know, assassinated a CEO in Total or anything like that. But you can show the public where the accumulation of capital by the production of fossil fuels is happening, where it's originating, because there are places, there are properties, there are installations where this process emanates from. How to link the two. And then, of course, the question is how we link the climate struggle with more broadly working class struggles. This is a tremendously complicated and difficult question that I have discussed with Tajo, for instance, and others.
Yes.
In the case of
all those that haven't heard it, there's a Dissens podcast with Tajo Müller where Andreas and Tajo are discussing this question in a bit more.
In France, when I was in France in June, I was told that there are cases of Total refineries where workers have called for converting these facilities into completely different kinds of production. And here, French workers have, as I said, a more lively tradition of social struggle than in Germany. So it's not inconceivable that something like that can develop in France. But I don't think that the initiative for converting these companies will come fundamentally from the workers on the inside. I think it will have to come from a movement from the outside, but the movement from the outside, of course, needs to relate to the workers whose jobs are potentially in peril, and come up with a plan for converting these entities into other kinds of work where workers can have safe employment. Again, another quite inspiring case is the trade union in Petrobras, the big Brazilian oil and gas company, that has recently become quite radicalized thanks to eco-socialist agitation in Brazil, and are calling for a restructuring of that company and conversion of production and things like that.
Right.
So, yeah.
There's another question from the chat. Can you think of any strategies at the current state of societies in the global north to mobilize more people, so that you could block railways instead with 200, with 2,000 people?
Yeah.
What would be the strategies to mobilize more people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, railways, presumably these would be railways such as those in the lignite mines that carry coal.
Or like headquarters, like in Copenhagen now. Just like how do you get more people to leave normal like protesting and go into civil disobedience?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I have a ready-made recipe for recruitment here, but we need to, I would be repeating myself here, but we need to strike when the iron is hot. So learn to have these kind of actions in moments of climate disaster when these things are on people's minds. So in Germany, for instance, the floods that happened in the summer, in my understanding, really didn't induce any climate action in the moment. I mean, even the Greens were not inclined to say anything about coal or the auto industry in relation to these events, but rather talk about we need to prepare, we need to adapt, and things like that. I think that's a major mistake. I think we absolutely have to learn to make these connections in the heat of the moment. And someone wrote in the London Review of Books that the idea would be to take down one coal mine for every wildfire. And I think as an idea, that's not very bad. That's a way, we need to desperately connect these dots and break out of the mindset when these disasters happen.
Who's that we? Who's that? Is this publishers? Is that the movements?
The climate movement. Yeah. We need to learn to connect these dots and break through the idea that these disasters are challenges for us in terms of adaptation.
Right.
And that's been the rhetoric. You see it now in Canada when they ration fuel so that the army can go out and evacuate people. And the idea of rationing fuel should be used to mitigate the problem, not to adapt to it. But that's the only thing that states can do.
Right.
So the climate movement, we in the climate movement need to learn to act in those moments to break through that paralyzing ideology of adaptation, and instead show that unless we close these sources down, we just have more and more of it until we can't live any longer.
Right.
And then we need to, as I'm repeating myself here, but for us to be able to draw in more people in radical actions, we shouldn't target the very people that we want to draw in. Here's the mistake that I think Insulated Britain has been doing.
Right.
Although I mean, I don't want to condemn them. I don't want to just denounce them and say that
Okay, that makes for an interesting transition. In your book, you speak about how you used to flatten the tires of SUVs, and you also, well, let's stay with this because somebody asked, are you going to go back into activism? Was it a good idea to like aim at or target individual SUVs? And would you do it again? Would you yourself get your hands dirty again?
So to begin with, I just want to say that during COP26 in the final days,
Mhm.
60 SUVs were deflated in the West End, the more posher part of Glasgow. Of course, I welcome that. I mean, imagine if you had that on a massive scale.
But are SUV drivers, are they the right target then again? I mean,
not any SUV drivers, but SUVs in rich neighborhoods should definitely be targeted.
luxury emissions.
Sorry, luxury emissions. Yeah, luxury emissions. And you know, this will come out even more clearly in the third report, the third installment of the ongoing IPCC report. Just how much damage luxury emissions do. I mean, it's not like this is a dogmatic leftist obsession to point the finger at the rich. All the data shows that the actual damage to the climate system from the consumption made by the rich is absolutely mind-boggling and keeps growing.
Which is the 1%.
Yeah. And I don't see why we should not try to disrupt this kind of consumption, because if there's any kind of emission sources that should be reduced quickly, it's those that do not fulfill basic human needs. So private jets, super yachts, multiple SUVs, insanely large multiple energy guzzling houses. This is the kind of lifestyle that the rich and the ultra rich have, not because they can't survive otherwise, but because that's how they flaunt their wealth and live in luxury. And that kind of luxury is actually killing people. I mean, just imagine if you took this carbon mortality figure that...
I just did the math. There's a super yacht that has an emission of 22,000 tons of CO2 per year, one super yacht by Roman Abramovich, and that kills basically 5 people a year.
Yeah.
I just did the math for some research I did.
Yeah.
Yes, it is insane. And there's, I think, and I told this to a couple of friends and they got angry, and I thought that was very interesting, that you also need targets, that you need to stop individualizing the problem.
Yeah. And our states are never going to begin to go after these people, because if there are any people that our governments serve, it's the rich.
Right.
And their consumption is proceeding not only as if it's normal, but as if it's the ideal that everyone should strive to try to achieve. I mean, it's upheld as the epitome of human existence in our cultures. So a task for movements here, for the climate movement, is to establish a kind of moral stigma or public stigma on these things. Just like as when activists last year pull down the statues of slave traders in the UK or Confederacy generals in the US. That was a way to tell the public that we can't accept these statues as normal. And after that, you had a great, in the UK, not the least, a major shift when these statues were beginning to be taken down and names changed of buildings and streets and things like that.
Right. Obviously, I remember talking to somebody in Bristol, and she said that even the police chief stood by and was like, yeah, that seems to be the right action to do right now. We're not going to escalate the situation.
Yes. I was in Bristol just the other week, and it seems to be a very special place in the UK with a particular radical culture, where this worked perfectly and where there is general pride in what was achieved in the city. But I think the analogy isn't perfect, but similar things could be done in various circumstances if you go about it in a precise and intelligent fashion, and not just, deflate the tires of any cars, but go target specifically SUVs in rich neighborhoods. It's not that difficult. What I am going to do, I'm not going to tell anyone, because I'm not of that position that is often endorsed in certain civil disobedience circles that you have to be absolutely transparent about what you're going to do. You have to tell everyone, including the police, in advance of what you're going to do, and expose yourself to arrest. I mean, that's not my politics. If you're dealing with the forces of repression, your premise is that you want to avoid repression for as long as possible. That means if you want to achieve something, don't tell anyone what you're going to do. But generally, of course, personally, I'd be prepared and happy to engage in any of the actions that I'm advocating in principle, but I'm not going to tell you or anyone else what exactly I am planning to do or not.
Even though I'm curious to hear, I think that's a very good ending point for this conversation. Thank you so much, Andreas. It was.
And I can say that we hope to see some things happening in Sweden next year, but I'm not going to go more into details.
Cliffhanger right here.
Yeah.
Everybody, this was a talk of Collapse Total. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much, Andreas, for sharing your thoughts on the state of the climate movement and the more like what the climate movement has to do now. I did greatly enjoy it. And I wish everybody who was listening and watching did too. Thank you so much, Andreas.